I've tried to be the best Tim Cook I can be. That line is more than humility. It is a declaration of identity, a quiet manifesto, a way of understanding a leader who never wanted to imitate anyone, and especially never wanted to become the shadow of Steve Jobs. When Cook says those words, he's doing something rare among leaders of massive companies. He is exposing the inner logic that guides him. He's telling you he doesn't measure himself against the world, he measures himself against the person he is trying to become. And as his story unfolds, this sentence becomes the thread stitching everything together. It is the pulse beneath every decision, every habit, every moment of pressure. Because understanding Tim Cook requires understanding his obsession with being himself, even when the world demanded he become someone else. Cook did not join Apple to be an icon. He joined to fix a disaster. When he arrived, Apple was an organism bleeding internally. It moved, breathed, released products, told beautiful stories, but behind the scenes it operated with fragile chaos. Inventory spiraled out of control. Supply lines snapped. Forecasts were unreliable. Processes were scattered. Apple was artistically brilliant and operationally broken. Jobs was the face, Ive was the aesthetic conscience, but no one yet understood that the quiet, almost monastic man walking through the door would become the architect of Apple's stability. And without stability, no vision survives. Cook steps into this world not as a dreamer, but as a systems surgeon. He sees flows, inefficiencies, bottlenecks, pressure points. Numbers speak to him, but not as abstractions, as signals of human behavior. He recognizes that an organization reveals its psychology through its metrics. Delays aren't delays, they're failures in discipline. Quality lapses aren't accidents, they're cultural cracks. Chaos is not the absence of order, it is the consequence of leadership that tolerates ambiguity. Cook sees all of this immediately, and he understands that Apple cannot become great until it becomes predictable. But long before Apple, there is Tim Cook the person, shaped by the South, by silence, by restraint, by a childhood in a place where calm is not an emotion, but a survival tool. Alabama forms a leader who avoids unnecessary conflict, but does not fear hard decisions. A leader who does not shout, not because he lacks intensity, but because he values control. This is the contradiction at the center of Tim Cook, a reserved personality paired with a spine of steel. The book recounts an event, controversial in its specifics, but revealing in its impact, involving an act of racial hatred in his hometown. Regardless of which version one believes, the emotional truth is clear. Cook internalized at a young age the idea that discrimination is not theoretical. It is lived, felt, suffered, and that belief becomes a defining force in his leadership decades later, when he begins aligning Apple's public identity with values that reflect his internal compass: equality, fairness, sustainability, privacy, not as marketing strategies, but as moral responsibilities. Cook's relationship with work is shaped early too. He doesn't work to be seen. He works to make things function. People who seek validation chase visibility. People who chase meaning chase structure. Cook belongs to the second category. He's drawn to solving problems that most people never even notice. He finds purpose not in applause, but in the quiet satisfaction of order restored. His time at IBM intensifies this mindset. There, he becomes fluent in operational logic. He learns to read numbers the way others read language. A percentage shift becomes a narrative. A deviation in a forecast becomes a symptom. Inconsistency becomes a red flag about culture or leadership or communication. His brilliance isn't flamboyant. It's diagnostic. He becomes someone who sees the truth of an organization through the details it tries to ignore. So when Jobs interviews him for Apple, the encounter is almost clinical. Jobs was not looking for charisma. He was looking for someone who could absorb pressure without breaking, someone who could tell him the truth without trying to impress him, someone who could solve the problems he couldn't solve himself. Jobs expected to find competence. What he found was composure, and that surprised him. Cook's stillness was not passivity, it was strength. He spoke plainly, without selling himself. That honesty, that absence of performance, created immediate trust. When Cook arrives at Apple, he finds chaos disguised as creativity. Manufacturing is sloppy, logistics are messy, inventory is excessive, lead times are unpredictable, suppliers lack discipline. Apple's public magic hides private dysfunction, and Cook sees it all. He sees that Apple's future depends on someone turning the company into a system, and that becomes his mission, carried out silently but relentlessly. Cook does not believe in heroic leadership. He believes in institutional leadership. He believes in habits, in processes, in discipline, in the elimination of waste. That belief drives everything he does in those early years. He collapses suppliers, he restructures manufacturing, he reduces inventory to levels people consider reckless until they realize it forces teams to think faster. He turns Apple's supply chain into the most sophisticated operational machine in the history of consumer electronics. And he does it all without theatrics. No self-congratulation, no public persona. Just discipline. Quiet, precise, relentless discipline. His style becomes legendary inside Apple, not through inspiration, but through expectation. One of the defining stories from this period involves a meeting where a senior executive describes an unresolved problem with a supplier in China. Cook listens, he asks a few pointed questions, and then, without raising his voice, he says, "If this is so important, why are you here?" The implication is uncompromising. Responsibility requires presence. If something matters, you go. Today. Now. That is Cook's ideology. Accountability is physical. Leadership is direct. If the system is failing, you enter the system. You put your eyes on the problem. You fix it. That moment becomes folklore inside Apple. It teaches people that Cook's calm does not mean softness. It means precision. As COO, Cook becomes the backbone of the company. He's the one who turns ideas into products, concepts into inventory, ambition into reality. He becomes the invisible force allowing Ives' designs and Jobs' visions to become commercial miracles. And while he does this, he maintains his personal discipline, rising early, exercising with almost monastic regularity, working late, not out of obsession with success, but out of obsession with alignment. His internal order becomes Apple's operational order. So when Jobs' health declines, and the world starts wondering who will inherit the empire, the people inside Apple already know the answer. Cook has been running the machine for years. He understands the rhythm, he sees the architecture, he knows where the weak points are and where the system is strongest. But stepping into Jobs' seat is not simply accepting a promotion. It is stepping into a myth. It is inheriting the emotional imagination of millions of people. It is leading a company built by a man whose personality was the product. This is where Cook's quote returns with new weight. "I've tried to be the best Tim Cook I can be." Because when he becomes CEO, he makes a choice, not to imitate, not to recreate the electricity of Jobs, not to pretend he carries the same kind of vision. He chooses authenticity over performance, structure over spectacle, values over mythology. His first messages to the company reflect exactly that: steady, modest, grounded, yet firm. He doesn't try to speak like Jobs. He speaks like himself. And he signals a future where Apple will continue building extraordinary products, but with a stronger moral spine, a deeper sense of responsibility, a more explicit
into the role of CEO, something remarkable happens. The outside world expects turbulence, visible cracks, signs that Apple has lost the gravitational force that kept it aligned. Analysts circle like vultures, waiting for missteps. Commentators predict decline with a confidence that borders on eagerness. Everyone is looking for evidence that the magic is gone. But inside Apple, the transition feels different. It feels strangely stable. Not painless, not easy, but stable. Because Cook has been for years the quiet architect behind the curtain keeping everything functioning while Jobs was absent. And now that the curtain lifts, the world finally sees the person who has been running the machine in the shadows. Cook does not try to replace the fire of Jobs. He preserves the heat by maintaining the systems that allow the fire to exist. His first moves as CEO reflect a mind that understands that greatness must be institutional, not charismatic. He reinforces the decision-making frameworks, doubles down on operational excellence, and begins strengthening teams he knows will be essential for Apple's next chapter. Where Jobs led by instinct and creative aggression, Cook leads by structure and deliberate thought. And the company slowly shifts around him, not by being pushed, but by being rebalanced. The world sees Tim Cook the operator. What they miss is Tim Cook the moral strategist. It becomes increasingly clear that this dimension of him, the ethical spine that formed in his early life, is not an accessory to his leadership. It is the core of it. He begins weaving values directly into Apple's identity, and he does it with the same discipline he used to rebuild the supply chain. Privacy is not positioned as a feature. It becomes a principle. Environmental responsibility is not a corporate slogan. It becomes an engineering constraint. Diversity is not HR language. It becomes a leadership commitment that Cook treats as non-negotiable. And here emerges a defining pattern of Cook's psychology. He uses his influence not to amplify himself, but to reinforce the idea that companies of Apple's size have obligations, that power must be exercised with intention, that values scale, just like products. This is where the distinction between Cook and his contemporaries becomes sharp. Many CEOs talk about ethics as if they were accessories to strategy. Cook embeds ethics inside the machinery of strategy itself. He converts his internal compass into corporate architecture. But even as he builds this moral framework, he never abandons the operational mindset that shaped him. The discipline he brought to Apple's supply chain becomes a template for how he drives execution inside the company. He becomes famous for asking relentless questions, not hostile questions, but precise questions. Questions that expose when someone hasn't thought deeply enough about a problem. People learn quickly that coming unprepared to a meeting with Cook is like stepping onto thin ice, not because he humiliates, but because he sees everything. He sees when numbers don't align. He sees when a risk is being hidden inside a narrative. He sees when people try to impress him instead of giving him the truth. One of the recurring stories from his leadership is the way he reacts during crises. There is no panic, no visible stress, no agitation, just an almost unsettling calm. This calmness is not indifference, it's intentional. It signals to the organization that the system is stronger than the moment. Cook knows that leaders who panic create chaos that ripples downward. Leaders who remain centered create clarity, and clarity is what drives good decisions. This emotional discipline becomes one of Apple's invisible advantages under his leadership. As Apple moves into its next era, Cook begins shaping something that very few people expected him to succeed at: product expansion. His critics believed he lacked the creative instinct to guide new categories. They assumed Apple would stagnate. But Cook approaches innovation differently. He does not start with ideas. He starts with feasibility, ecosystems, and long-term strategic positioning. This leads Apple into wearables and services, not because he wants to be bold, but because he wants Apple to remain structurally diverse. The Apple Watch in particular becomes a symbol of Cook's administrative creativity. an idea developed inside a framework, not through a sudden burst of intuition. It reflects his worldview. Innovation must scale, must integrate with existing systems, and must extend Apple's platform advantage. Under Cook, Apple becomes a company defined not by singular products, but by interconnected experiences. Services revenue grows because it fits into this system. AirPods succeed because they plug into it. The iPhone evolves because the ecosystem around it expands. This system-based vision is what Cook excels at. He builds platforms, not objects. But the outside world rarely notices the depth of this transformation. They still look for the ghost of Jobs in every keynote. They ask where the next revolution is. They miss the fact that Cook's revolutions are quiet, infrastructural, and cumulative. Where Jobs shaped culture, Cook shapes continuity. Jobs created shockwaves. Cook creates stability that can last decades. But stability should not be confused with softness. Cook can be ruthlessly demanding. His expectations for performance are non-negotiable. Employees describe his level of discipline as monastic, his memory for numbers almost unsettling. He walks into meetings already knowing the data, not because he was briefed, but because he studies. He outprepares everyone in the room. And this creates a culture where preparation becomes a form of respect. You don't walk into a meeting with Tim Cook unless you've thought through every angle. Otherwise, he will expose the gap instantly. And then there is his relationship with China. This is perhaps the most strategically underestimated aspect of Tim Cook's leadership. He doesn't just manage Apple's presence in China, he architects it. He understands that China is not simply a manufacturing hub, it is the backbone of Apple's global scale. And he treats that relationship with surgical precision. Cook handles China with a mixture of pragmatism and long-view thinking. Not ideological, not emotional, just clear strategy. He knows that supply chains are geopolitical structures, not just corporate ones. And he maintains these relationships with a kind of diplomatic steadiness that defines his approach to complexity. This viewpoint is consistent with everything about him: the calm, the discipline, the absence of theatrics, the belief that solutions come from systems, not improvisation. Even the way he confronts global issues like privacy battles with governments reflects this. When he stands in front of the public and declares privacy a fundamental human right, he is not posturing. He is articulating the same moral logic that formed inside him decades earlier. That internal compass is steady. It does not waver when the stakes rise. And this steadiness is what allows him to grow into the role of a modern corporate statesman, something Apple never had before. Jobs was an icon. Cook becomes an ambassador, but not in the ceremonial sense. He becomes a leader who positions Apple not just as a tech company, but as a moral force inside an increasingly chaotic industry. He presents privacy, security, sustainability, and equality as competitive advantages. This is his form of innovation, designing values that scale like products. But perhaps the most fascinating dimension of Cook's leadership is the quiet intensity behind it. He speaks softly, but he works fiercely. He rarely raises his voice, but when he asks someone why they are still sitting in a meeting instead of flying to China to solve a crisis, he reveals the iron under the calm. That moment is Cook distilled: direct, unemotional, decisive. A leader who believes that responsibility must be embodied,
While he brings this weight into
not
Apple's
delegated.
internal world, he carries an equally heavy sense of responsibility about his personal identity. When he eventually comes out publicly, he does not do it to become a symbol. He does it because he believes visibility can reduce suffering for others. It is an act of leadership, not self-promotion. And once again, his internal compass becomes external architecture. His decision changes Apple. It opens space. It signals values. It reinforces the culture he wants to build, a culture where people bring their full selves to work without fear.
As the years unfold, something becomes undeniable. Tim Cook does not transform Apple with spectacle. He transforms it with accumulated decisions that reshape the company's shape, its rhythm, and its moral center. He creates an Apple that feels less like the product of a single mind and more like the product of an institutional philosophy. He builds a company designed to outlive him. And yet, through all of this, the original quote keeps echoing in the background. "I've tried to be the best Tim Cook I can be." It becomes clearer and clearer that this is not a modest statement. It is a strategy. It is a refusal to chase ghosts. It is Cook telling the world that the only sustainable form of leadership is the one rooted
As
in
Apple moves
authenticity
further into the
and
Cook
discipline.
era, an interesting transformation happens inside the culture. The fear-based intensity of the Jobs years begins to evolve into something different, not softer, not easier, but more structured, more predictable, more scalable. Under Jobs, the company thrived on creative chaos, on tension, on dramatic swings of energy. Under Cook, it thrives on rhythm. He introduces a kind of operational heartbeat to Apple. Cadence becomes a competitive advantage. Predictability becomes a weapon. Teams know what is expected, know the tempo, know that execution is not something they scramble for, but something they live in. The culture becomes a machine that produces excellence because the system demands it, not because fear enforces it. This shift scares some outsiders. They interpret stability as stagnation. They assume that without fireworks, Apple can't innovate. But that interpretation reveals something fundamental about how little people understand the nature of innovation at scale. Innovation is not a moment. It is a system. It is an environment. It is the ability to deliver something new without compromising the machine that delivers it. Under Cook, innovation becomes less of a miracle and more of an operating principle. Take the Apple Watch, a product dismissed by skeptics, minimized by analysts, questioned by those who believed Apple had lost its spark. But the watch becomes a case study in how Cook approaches innovation: slow, deliberate, integrated. It starts as a curiosity and evolves into a health platform that saves lives, tracks physiology, and elevates Apple from a tech company into a companion for daily living. This is Cook's vision: products that fit into a system, that create long-term value, that compound. Where Jobs created singular icons, Cook creates interconnected modules that strengthen the ecosystem with every release. And that ecosystem becomes Apple's gravitational field. Every product that enters it gains power from the network of others. AirPods are not just earphones, they are a node. Services are not just revenue, they are glue. And the iPhone, once the whole universe, becomes the sun around which an entire solar system spins. Cook understands that hardware alone cannot carry Apple for decades. An ecosystem, however, can. Under his leadership, Apple becomes a company defined less by any single product and more by the dense web of relationships between them. But beyond the products, beyond the ecosystem, beyond the operational mastery, there is something deeper shaping Apple's trajectory: Cook's philosophy of restraint. He believes in saying no. He believes in doing fewer things with more intention. This philosophy is often misunderstood because it lacks the drama of big announcements. But restraint is a form of discipline, and discipline is what allows Apple to avoid the traps that kill great companies: chasing trends, diluting focus, losing identity. Cook keeps the company pointed in a single direction: forward but not frantic, growing but not scattered. And yet restraint does not mean passivity. When Cook feels strongly about an issue, he acts with a boldness that surprises people who misjudge his calm demeanor. Whether it's refusing to unlock the iPhone for the FBI, making Apple carbon neutral, or speaking openly about equality, he steps into the arena with clarity. There is a moral seriousness to these decisions. Cook does not posture. He does not escalate for attention. He looks at a problem, examines the principles at stake, evaluates the strategic implications, and then moves with conviction. His leadership has a quiet force behind it. Not loud, not theatrical, but grounded.
This groundedness becomes especially evident in moments of crisis. When product issues arise, when supply chain disruptions threaten timelines, when public scrutiny intensifies, Cook's response remains the same: calm, methodical, unshakable. He believes that an organization mirrors the psychology of its leader. If the leader becomes emotional, the system destabilizes. If the leader remains centered, the system holds. And Apple holds. Inside the company, people talk about how Cook's presence changes a room, not by volume, not by charisma, by focus. He pays attention with a level of intensity that makes people sharpen their thoughts. His silence can feel heavier than someone else's speech. When he finally asks a question, it cuts to the structural truth of the problem. This is why his leadership works. He sees the architecture behind the chaos. He sees patterns in complexity. He sees how small decisions cascade into systemic outcomes. And he expects others to see this too. This expectation creates a culture where operational literacy becomes a universal skill. Designers understand manufacturing. Engineers understand suppliers. Executives understand logistics. Everyone understands that Apple is not a collection of departments, it is a single organism with interconnected systems. This integration is the Cook signature. It makes Apple resilient. But leadership is not just about systems, it's also about identity. And Cook's identity takes a pivotal turn when he comes out publicly. It is one of the most personal leadership decisions made by a CEO of his stature. He frames it not as an act of courage, but an act of responsibility. He believes that silence can harm people who need representation. And so he speaks, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. He writes a letter that aligns with his moral compass, with the quiet conviction that shaped him from childhood. And when he does this, Apple shifts again. Culture expands. People feel something change inside the organization. A leader's authenticity becomes permission for others to exist fully. This is where Cook's story intersects with something deeper than business. Leadership is not only about building systems, it is also about building trust. Cook builds trust by being consistent, by aligning his actions with his values, by refusing to perform an identity that isn't true. And this is why Apple remains stable under his command. People trust him. They might not always agree with him, but they trust the integrity behind his thinking. As the years progress, Cook confronts new challenges: trade tensions with China, intensifying competition, regulatory scrutiny, and the complexities of running the most valuable company on earth. But he doesn't respond with defensiveness. He responds with the same measured discipline that defines everything he does. He makes long-term bets. He strengthens supply chain redundancies. He shifts production footprints. He invests in privacy as a strategic moat. He transforms Apple's environmental commitments into engineering constraints that drive innovation instead of limiting it. And all the while, the world continues to look for the next Steve Jobs. They continue measuring Cook against a standard that was never meant for him. They miss the point. They miss what leadership actually is. Cook is not a visionary in the mythological sense. He is something rarer, a steward of institutional greatness. Someone who can take a masterpiece built by another man and not only preserve it, but evolve it, expand it, professionalize it, and protect it from entropy. His leadership is not loud. It is cumulative. It compounds. It works day by day, decision by decision, question by question. And this compounding is what gives Apple its strength. No single moment defines Cook. His legacy is the trajectory he creates. And as Apple enters its next decade, the company reflects his character more than anyone expected. A company that is intense but measured, bold but disciplined, ambitious but grounded, ethical but competitive, operationally fierce but culturally conscious. Apple becomes the embodiment of the quiet leader with the steel
That
spine.
original quote keeps returning. I've tried to be the best Tim Cook I can be. The more you hear it, the more it transforms. It ceases to sound humble. It begins to sound like a strategy. It becomes a philosophy of leadership in a world that worships imitation. It becomes a rejection of the idea that greatness must look dramatic. It becomes a reminder that the most powerful leaders are often the ones who refuse to be anyone else. And so the story of Tim Cook becomes the story of a different kind of greatness. Not the cinematic, not the mythologized, not the kind that becomes a poster on a college dorm wall. His greatness is slow, deliberate, cumulative. It emerges out of thousands of disciplined choices made over years. It is the greatness of someone who understands that leadership at scale is not about the brilliance of a single mind, but about the construction of a system that can think, act, and evolve long after any one person is gone. This is why Cook's chapter in Apple's history matters. He proves that an organization can shift from the genius model to the institutional model without losing its edge. He proves that a company built around a visionary can morph into a company built around values, execution, and structure, and still generate products people love. He proves that discipline, moral clarity, and operational excellence can be a form of creativity, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that endures. Under Cook, Apple becomes something that the world underestimated: a fortress. A fortress built not of secrecy or charisma, but of repeatable excellence. A fortress where every function strengthens the others. A fortress with allies across continents, suppliers across decades, and customers across generations. A fortress whose foundations were laid by Jobs, but whose walls were built, reinforced, and extended by Cook. And inside those walls, the culture evolves into one where people understand that innovation does not require chaos. It requires stability. It requires integrity. It requires someone who can see the whole system while everyone else sees only their own part. Cook's leadership reveals something else: that the future of Apple would not be shaped by predicting the next big thing, but by making the company resilient enough to adapt to whatever the next big thing turns out to be. He doesn't chase revolutions. He positions Apple so that it benefits from them. He doesn't gamble on trends. He builds frameworks that absorb them. His brilliance is architectural, not theatrical. And this is what the critics always misunderstood. They looked for spectacle. He built infrastructure. They looked for unpredictability. He built reliability. They looked for a visionary. He built a vision that lives inside the system rather than inside a single person. And it is this systemic vision, quiet, durable, almost invisible, that becomes Apple's ultimate competitive advantage. But if you want to understand Tim Cook fully, if you want to understand what truly defines him, you have to look not at the company he runs, but at the person he is when the spotlight is off. A man who rises before dawn, who values solitude, who thinks deeply before speaking, who protects his privacy, not out of secrecy, but out of principle. A man who believes that humility is a form of discipline, that focus is a moral responsibility, that success is measured not by noise, but by the integrity of your decisions. You see it in the way he handles pressure. You see it in the way he refuses to rush judgment. You see it in the way he writes to his team in the hardest moments, not with grandiosity, but with steadiness. You see it in the way he steps into conflicts with governments, not with provocation, but with conviction. You see it in the way he handles the delicate balance of global supply chains, not with opportunism, but with long-term thinking. All of these traits converge into a single idea. Cook is a leader who understands that greatness is not an act, it is a discipline. It is a practice. It is a pattern repeated across time until it becomes identity, and that identity becomes influence. And eventually, as you trace the arc of his life, from Alabama to IBM to Compaq to Apple, the opening quote returns with new meaning. "I've tried to be the best Tim Cook I can be." At first glance, it sounds modest.
almost too plain for a man running one of the most powerful companies in the world. But by the end of his story, the quote transforms. It becomes a declaration of independence, a refusal to imitate, a commitment to authenticity, a reminder that leadership collapses when it becomes performance, a statement of confidence in the idea that a person becomes powerful not by trying to be someone else, but by refining the strongest version of who they already are. And it becomes a challenge to the listener, to anyone who leads, anyone who builds, anyone who makes decisions that affect others. The challenge is this: can you design your leadership around your own identity rather than borrowing the identity of others? Can you build systems that outlast you? Can you resist the pressure to perform and instead focus on the discipline required to deliver? Can you ground your decisions in principles that do not shift with public opinion? Cook answers these questions not with speeches, but with the way he shows up every day, with the way he studies the details, with the way he holds the line on privacy, with the way he commits Apple to the environment, not as a marketing gesture, but as an engineering constraint, with the way he builds long-term structures while the world obsesses over short-term cycles, with the way he carries quiet strength into a role once defined by loud genius. And so the story closes where it began, with a sentence that, in its simplicity, contains the philosophy of an entire life. I've tried to be the best Tim Cook I can be. It is the line that unlocks his psychology, that reveals his clarity, that explains his impact. It is the loop that brings the narrative back to its center. Because in the end, leadership is not noise. Leadership is not spectacle. Leadership is the accumulation of disciplined choices that align with who you are. Leadership is the process of becoming the most capable version of yourself, and then using that capability to build something that lasts. Tim Cook did exactly that. He became the best Tim Cook he could be. And in doing so, he protected, expanded, and redefined one of the most important companies in the world.